There's a silence more powerful than any argument. It's the silence you leave behind when you walk away, not with anger, not with drama, but with a quiet certainty that you deserve something deeper. And yet, that silence echoes, not just in the room, but in his psyche, in the vast invisible terrain where a man's ego meets the edge of his unprocessed self. When you leave, something ancient stirs, not just in him, but in the field between you. Because walking away isn't just a physical act. It's a rupture in the energetic agreement. It's the moment the emotional contract breaks, and the ego, so used to holding the upper hand, starts to lose its ground. Carl Jung said, "The ego is always at the center of consciousness." But when you step back, you don't just walk away from the man, you step outside the realm where his ego held power. That's where the unraveling begins. On the surface, he may act indifferent, cold, composed. But the truth is, emotional detachment is often just the shell that forms when the inner world is too chaotic to face. And when that shell is cracked, by your absence, by your silence, it's not reason that takes over, it's survival. Joe Dispenza reminds us that the brain becomes chemically addicted to certain emotional patterns. If control, validation, or superiority were part of his emotional feedback loop, your withdrawal becomes more than just distance. It becomes neurological chaos. A storm inside the system that once used your attention as fuel. The man who once seemed emotionally impenetrable suddenly finds himself destabilized. Not always immediately, not always consciously, but something shifts, something breaks. Because what you took with you wasn't just your presence, it was his reflection. The reflection that told him he was needed, desired, significant. And when that reflection disappears, the ego begins to starve. Jung believed that the ego fights hardest not against others, but against the unknown within. That unknown is now in full view. Your absence becomes the mirror that no longer flatters, no longer reflects the image he clung to. And what stares back is a shadow. The part he never wanted to meet. The part that remembers childhood wounds, rejection, inadequacy. The part he buried under achievement, control, and emotional coolness. This is not about blame. This is about understanding. Because you too are in this field. You too feel the tremor, not just of his reaction, but of your own evolution. Walking away is not a performance, it's a return. A sacred act of choosing wholeness over hunger. And yet, you still wonder, if he acts so cold, did it ever matter? Here's the hidden truth. Coldness is often a cry frozen in time. It's grief that never found language. It's longing disguised as detachment. It's the ego doing what it knows, protecting itself from the collapse it fears most. Rejection, insignificance, loss of control. And so the war begins. But it's not the war you see. It's the silent war between a wounded male ego and the feminine presence that no longer feeds it. Between the persona he projects and the emptiness he can no longer numb. Between the illusion of indifference and the inner world unraveling quietly behind it. Because when you walk away, you don't just leave the room. You exit the story his ego depended on. You withdraw from the drama that gave him significance, and in that silence, his shadow speaks, loudly, desperately, even if his mouth remains closed, even if his eyes turn away. This is where your power lives, not in confrontation but in your capacity to see clearly what he cannot yet face. That his coldness is not strength, that his silence is not peace, that behind the mask, a fracture has begun, and it started the moment you chose yourself. There's a particular kind of silence that doesn't soothe. It cuts. You feel it not just in your mind, but in your chest, in your stomach, in the way your breath changes when he pulls away emotionally. He doesn't scream. He doesn't chase. He just disappears behind a wall of indifference. But what if I told you that behind that wall, there's a wound wide open? Coldness is not always apathy. Often, it's fear in disguise. Deep fear. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of being exposed. Fear of losing the illusion of control. And when that fear feels unbearable, the ego builds armor. That armor is called distance, it's called arrogance, it's called detachment. It looks like he doesn't care, but inside, something is collapsing. From an early age, most men are taught one thing above all else: do not show weakness. Vulnerability is treated like a threat. Sensitivity is shamed. The emotional body becomes a battlefield where feeling too much means losing power. So what does he do when he starts to feel too much? He retreats, he shuts down, he puts on a mask so convincing that even you begin to believe he's unaffected. But he is affected, deeply. He just doesn't know how to name it. He doesn't know how to hold it. And because he cannot hold it, he punishes instead. Not overtly, not loudly, but with silence, with emotional withholding, with the subtle coldness that feels like punishment, not peace. That's because for some men, withholding affection is the only way they've ever learned to feel in control. And when your departure threatens that control, emotional retaliation becomes his unconscious weapon. This is not emotional maturity, it's emotional survival. His silence isn't resolution, it's resistance. It's a desperate attempt to recalibrate power in a moment where he feels powerless. Not because you harmed him, but because your absence revealed something he has long avoided, the truth of his inner chaos. We've been taught to see emotional stillness in men as strength, but strength without emotional integration is just repression. And repression always leaks out, through passive aggression, through avoidance, through subtle cruelty masked as indifference. So when he acts cold, ask yourself, is this detachment or is this defense? Think of the iceberg. What you see above the surface is only a fraction of what exists below. His coldness is the tip, but beneath it, a vast, frozen landscape of unspoken emotion, disappointment, insecurity, grief, a longing for connection that he's never fully owned, because owning it would mean risking exposure. And exposure, especially after you've walked away, is unbearable to a fragile ego that equates vulnerability with defeat. You may feel tempted to interpret his silence as final, as confirmation that it never mattered, that he never felt it. But the feminine intuition knows better. You don't just feel what's visible. You feel the undercurrent, the tension, the subtle resistance that tells you something is happening, even if he refuses to show it. And here's the most painful paradox. The colder he gets, the more he reveals the wound. Because true indifference requires no performance. But a man who's unaffected doesn't need to mask. The mask appears when something inside can't breathe, when something inside is breaking, and the only way he knows how to hold it together is to pretend he feels nothing at all. So don't be fooled by the frost. It's not the absence of feeling, it's the inability to process feeling safely. And in that inability, his coldness becomes not a boundary, but a broadcast. A silent message saying, I don't know how to hold what's happening inside me now that you're no longer here. There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when the energy shifts. You say less. You expect less. You stop chasing clarity from someone who offers confusion, and in that stillness, something turns. Not outside, but within the silent theater of emotional power. What once was his illusion of control begins to dissolve, simply because you no longer participate in the performance. When a woman walks away, not in anger, but in alignment, she doesn't just leave the room. She alters the energetic field. The dynamic that once fed his ego, his certainty, his rhythm, begins to starve. Where there was once pursuit, there is now absence. Where there was once emotional currency, your attention, your reaction, your concern, there is now space. That space is unsettling to him, not because he wants you back necessarily, but because he no longer feels himself in the same way without you. Power, true power, is not always loud. Sometimes it is the calm refusal to engage. When you stop reacting, you break a silent agreement that kept the dynamic alive. The agreement that said, you get to hold the upper hand, and I will respond accordingly. But now the polarity shifts. He is no longer the one being observed. He becomes the observer. And what he sees is not your weakness, but your withdrawal, your sovereignty, your silence. This energetic inversion confuses the ego. Because the ego is addicted to response. It feeds on attention, even if that attention comes from pain. Your emotional availability used to be his mirror, reflecting his power back to him. Now the mirror is gone. Now he stands alone, unsure of where the reflection went. And here's the trap so many fall into, waiting for that ego to validate your decision, waiting for him to say he finally sees your worth, that he regrets, that he understands. But understand this, the ego doesn't grant closure. It resists it. Because closure would mean surrendering the very control it clings to. Instead of waiting, you must remember, emotional validation is not something to be handed to you. It's something to reclaim, to embody, to walk in. Your departure was never a test for him. It was a return to you. And while he may interpret your leaving as punishment, in truth, it was liberation. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow speaks to this perfectly. The parts of ourselves we deny, repress, hide, they don't disappear. They emerge through projection, and when you walk away, his shadow begins to stir. The cold exterior was never just about you. It was a way to manage what he could not integrate. Your absence now forces him to meet those exiled parts. The insecure boy, the unhealed wounds, the buried longing he once masked with dominance or detachment. But don't expect that meeting to be graceful. The ego resists being seen in its rawness. It lashes out, or it retreats. It projects blame, or it denies. But beneath it all, something is unraveling. The persona, the mask, is no longer enough to hold the illusion together. This is where your emotional non-reaction becomes the most powerful act of all. Not because it's a tactic, but because it's truth. When you hold your center, when you don't flinch at his silence, don't beg for closure, don't collapse into guilt, you create a new kind of field, one that is sovereign, one that is stable, one that no longer rewards psychological games with emotional supply. That's what breaks the cycle. Not a dramatic goodbye, not a long explanation, just the absence of reaction. It's disorienting to someone used to emotional power plays, but it's also awakening. Because for the first time, he's forced to meet himself without your energy buffering his ego. So if he seems unaffected, let him seem. If he blames you for the silence, let him blame. You are no longer here to carry projections. You are here to return to your own frequency, to your own center, to the version of you that no longer needs to be seen in order to feel real. That's the inversion. That's the shift. And once it happens, once you truly feel it, there is no going back. What feels like indifference often isn't. What looks like coldness often hides a storm. There's a truth that many women struggle to accept, not because they can't understand it, but because it hurts too much to hold. And that some men, especially those with avoidant attachment patterns, do feel deeply. But the feeling isn't the problem. The problem is what the feeling means inside their nervous system. For a man with avoidant tendencies, intimacy isn't soothing, it's threatening. Connection isn't comfort, it's chaos. Not because you did something wrong, but because closeness stirs something ancient in him. A memory, a pattern, a wound, something that says, if I let you close, I will lose control. If I feel this, I won't survive it. And so he detaches, not as cruelty, but as a learned form of protection. He might have grown up in a home where emotions were dismissed or weaponized, where vulnerability wasn't met with love, but with silence, shame, or volatility. In that environment, feelings become dangerous, so he learned to survive by disconnecting from them. He learned to become emotionally efficient, stoic, controlled, unreachable. And now when your presence invites something warmer, softer, more open, it doesn't feel safe, it feels destabilizing. So when you walk away, there's no instant collapse, no visible remorse. Instead, there's often distance, denial, delay. And that delay can be brutal to witness, because it creates a cruel illusion that your leaving meant nothing, that your presence held no weight. But that's not the truth. The truth is that avoidant attachment has a lag. The impact sinks in slowly, through cracks in his emotional armor he didn't even know were there. The male brain, wired for compartmentalization, often suppresses vulnerability using neurochemical defenses. Dopamine, the reward chemical, gets starved when connection is lost. Cortisol, the stress hormone, spikes in confusion, but because he's trained himself to ignore these signals, he doesn't interpret them as loss. Not right away. He feels the disruption, but doesn't know how to name it. So he calls it freedom, relief, space. Until days or weeks later, something unexpected triggers him. A scent, a memory, an empty room. And suddenly, the absence he once celebrated becomes unbearable. Here's where it gets complicated. That delayed pain doesn't always translate into a healthy return. Sometimes it becomes anger, projection, a need to reclaim control, not connection. He might come back, but not from love, from discomfort, not from realization, but from panic. And if you misread that return as clarity, you might fall back into the very dynamic that wounded you. Again, this is why your discernment matters. It's why your pause is sacred, because when you understand avoidant attachment, you stop personalizing the silence. You stop making his delay mean you weren't enough, and you start seeing it for what it is. A man lost inside himself, trapped between what he feels and what he believes he's allowed to feel. Avoidant men often lack the tools to metabolize emotional reality in real time. That doesn't make them evil. It makes them unprepared. And unprepared doesn't mean incapable, but it does mean that change won't come from your effort alone. It has to come from his willingness to meet the parts of himself he's buried, to feel without fleeing, to stay without shutting down. So when you don't get the reaction you hoped for, don't rush to interpret it. Don't collapse into self-doubt. Don't assume your worth was invisible. Instead, take a breath, step back. Remember, emotional pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hides, sometimes it delays, and sometimes it returns, not to heal, but to repeat. But you don't have to repeat. Not this time, because now you see the difference between coldness and coping, between reaction and regulation, between someone who feels and someone who can actually hold what they feel without hurting you in the process. There's a kind of silence that isn't absence, it's presence amplified. A silence that doesn't scream but echoes. A silence that doesn't ask for attention but demands awareness. When you choose not to react, not to chase, not to explain, you activate something in the unseen layers of energy between you and him. You don't just walk away, you withdraw your frequency. And that, more than any word, becomes the loudest message you can send. The feminine, in her essence, is an energetic field. She doesn't need to speak to be felt. She doesn't need to prove to be known. But she does need to protect what she feels. And when a woman finally honors her own stillness over his chaos, when she chooses her peace over the performance of fixing, she shifts the entire dynamic. She stops being the emotional provider. She stops holding space for his avoidance. And in that interruption, something sacred happens. A vacuum is created. And nature, as Neville Goddard reminds us, hates a vacuum. The moment you stop pouring your energy into a man who is feeding off your emotional availability, his subconscious feels the loss. Not necessarily as love lost, but as power disrupted. The energetic rhythm that once reassured his ego has stopped. The game board flipped, the pattern collapsed. And even if he doesn't understand it consciously, something inside him knows. The mirror has been removed. Most men, especially those used to emotional dominance, expect a performance when a woman leaves. Tears, pleading, explanations, emotional theater. But when you walk away with calm, with silence, with coherence, it disturbs the story. It disturbs the system. Because suddenly, he's not the center of the scene. He's outside the frame, watching, guessing, wondering. And that uncertainty doesn't soothe his ego. It shatters it. You're no longer reflecting his importance. You're no longer feeding his identity with your attention. And in that void, something begins to grow. Something he didn't prepare for. A reality without you in orbit around him. Neville Goddard taught that imagination creates reality. But here's what that really means in this context. Your inner world, your vibration, your thoughts, your silence, is the blueprint from which your outer reality unfolds. So, while he may be trying to reclaim power in the physical, by acting cold or silent or unaffected, you're already altering the field. Because your absence is not empty. It's intelligent, it's creative, it's magnetic. You're no longer reacting, you're rewriting. The metaphor of the forest after fire speaks here. When a fire sweeps through a wild landscape, it leaves only ash and silence behind. At first it looks like destruction, loss, emptiness, but give it time, and that soil becomes fertile in ways it never was before. Life returns, slowly, quietly, but never in the same form. That's what your silence becomes. The fertile void, the sacred in-between, the space where the next version of you begins to root. And here's the deeper truth. When you stop explaining yourself to someone who was never truly listening, when you stop performing emotion for someone who only needed your presence to feel powerful, you reclaim the energy you've been leaking. You begin to hear your own voice again. You begin to feel the difference between love and obligation, between connection and codependence. This is not about punishing him. It's not about pretending you don't care. It's about remembering that silence is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's remembering that the void you create isn't emptiness, it's alignment. And what fills it next depends entirely on what you refuse to allow back in. There comes a moment in every woman's journey when she no longer walks away in anger. She walks away in truth, not to punish, not to provoke, not even to be seen, but to return. Return to the self she had abandoned in the name of connection. Return to the center she had outsourced while trying to hold someone else's emotional weight. This is not an escape, it's a reclamation. Because the walkaway moment is not about him. It never was. It's about the frequency you choose to no longer betray in yourself. Every time you over-explained, every time you waited for a reaction, every time you tolerated confusion, you were inching away from your own alignment. And now the silence you step into becomes sacred ground. Not a punishment, not an ending, but a portal back to your own energy. When you stop feeding the dynamic, you interrupt the feedback loop. You shift the frequency. You send out a different signal to the universe, one that says, I no longer vibrate at the level of ambiguity. I no longer magnetize dynamics that dim me. And that signal matters, because frequency doesn't lie. What you are willing to tolerate is what you are calling in. And when you no longer tolerate the version of you that begged for crumbs, you stop attracting people who throw them. There's a grief that comes with this shift, not because you lost him, but because you lost so much of yourself trying to hold him, and sometimes walking away feels like guilt, especially if you're someone who was trained by trauma, by culture, by codependency, to believe that love means staying, that leaving means harm. But here's the truth that sets you free. Guilt is often the echo of a nervous system that only knows connection through self-abandonment. It's not a signal to return, it's a signal to heal. This is why the temptation to break no contact can feel so seductive. It's not always about love. Often it's about relief. Relief from the discomfort of holding your own boundary. Relief from the withdrawal symptoms of emotional enmeshment. But going back to soothe your guilt is not love. It's re-entering the loop that kept you small. It's giving your power back to the very place it was taken from. And so, in this space of silence, you meet yourself. Not the version of you he knew, not the version of you that performed worthiness, but the one who no longer needs to prove her value through proximity to someone emotionally unavailable. You begin to stabilize your field, to breathe again, to remember the sound of your own clarity. Coherence breathing becomes a daily prayer, not just to regulate your nervous system, but to remind your body what safety feels like inside yourself. Inhale, you return. Exhale, you release. Inhale, you reclaim. Exhale, you reset. And from this rhythm, you reframe your intentions, not from scarcity, not from fear of being alone, but from a place of wholeness that no longer negotiates with confusion. Because here's what they never taught us. True feminine power is not in how much you feel for someone. It's in how clearly you feel yourself through someone. And when you reclaim your frequency, you no longer operate from emotional hunger. You operate from sovereignty, and that changes everything. You don't chase, you don't explain, you don't wait. You align. And from that alignment, you no longer manifest relationships based on need. You magnetize ones that match your healed vibration. Ones that honor your clarity, not your chaos. Ones that recognize you, not because you tried to be enough, but because you never abandoned yourself to begin with. You're not leaving him behind. You're remembering the woman you were before you handed over your power. And she's been waiting, not for his return, but for yours. There is something profoundly alchemical about walking away, not in anger, not in desperation, but in energetic clarity. Because what you leave behind is not just silence. You leave behind a mirror that no longer reflects his power, a mirror that no longer shows him the version of himself he carefully curated in your presence, a mirror that now, in your absence, forces him to confront a void. And in that void, he meets the parts of himself he spent years avoiding. Carl Jung once said, "We do not see others as they are, but as we are." And that is the secret most never realize. He was never seeing you. He was seeing the projection of what his ego needed you to be. He was seeing the reflection of his own power, his own value, his own desirability, validated through your presence, your emotion, your availability. And when you left, it wasn't just you that disappeared. It was the illusion. The illusion of control, the illusion of dominance, the illusion of emotional safety he derived from being the one who needed less. When that projection collapses, something far more terrifying emerges. Not the loss of a woman, but the loss of a self-image. And that, for the ego, is annihilation. The cold exterior may remain, the mask may not crack, but underneath, a reckoning begins. A reckoning he may never speak of, but one that reshapes him nonetheless. And here is where Neville Goddard's truth whispers with piercing clarity. Feeling is the secret. Because how you walk away, what you feel in that moment, becomes the energetic seed of everything that follows. If you leave in guilt, you attract guilt. If you leave in fear, you attract more loops of confusion. But if you leave in coherence, in peace, in alignment, in self-trust, you open timelines that were never available before. This is not about getting him back. This is about getting you back. Because in that final moment, what you're really doing is choosing a new emotional reality. And the universe responds to that choice. Not with logic, not with punishment, but with mirrors. Mirrors that show you exactly where your frequency stands. Your silence becomes more than absence. It becomes instruction. It becomes an invisible curriculum that teaches him something no conversation ever could. That your presence was never his right. That your love was not his entitlement. That your energy had value beyond what he was willing or able to honor. And maybe he will never say it. Maybe he'll never apologize, never admit the shift. But it happens. Quietly, invisibly. Like ripples in a lake, long after the stone has sunk. Symbolically, you become the mirror that refuses to reflect. And in that refusal, you do what no performance, no pleading, no explanation ever could. You invite him to meet himself. And whether he takes that invitation is no longer your concern, because your path is no longer tied to his awakening. Your peace is no longer a bargain for his recognition. You didn't walk away to teach him a lesson. You walked away because you finally heard the whisper inside you saying, "You've learned yours." And now, in the hush you leave behind, echoes a question he cannot outrun. A question that haunts not because it is cruel, but because it is true. Who am I without the power I once thought I had over her? And for you, the answer doesn't matter anymore, because now you are home.